Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're going to be introducing you to some basic concepts, not only in custom, but specifically in rites of passage. You can probably come back to this one just as a refresher for some of these terms when we do talk about the calendar customs in the second half of the semester, because there's going to be a fair amount of overlap. But it's good to sort of know these terms because some of you might not have ever taken a course in folklore before, and some of you might have taken a course in folklore before but don't necessarily have a handle on some of the concepts that are going to be touched on almost inevitably when we talk about rites of passage and calendar customs. So I just wanted to give you this heads up, this sort of primer, as it were, in a couple of things. And one of them, of course, is, folklore itself. Many of you might be new to this. If you've taken the course before, you've probably heard this, so I'll be very brief. Folklore could be understood as the stuff, the things that were passed down through some kind of, or from some kind of past into, through a particular kind of people. Basically, a very othering term, the folk. And the lore is just kind of the weird stuff they did. Sometimes it's celebrated and sometimes it's dismissed. I mean, celebrated by we now privileged middle class types in university settings and with the benefit of certain forms of education and so on. We're like, this is the stuff of these people. Sometimes it's wonderful and we seek it out, and because it's kind of awesome and it might tell us something about this place at this time. And it might be something that we are trying to retrieve. At the other time, we can simultaneously hold it at arm's length and just that is just folklore, that is just something else. So you have this idea of, on one hand, you can think of it as like the lore of the folk in this kind of remnants idea, but that doesn't necessarily suggest anything. And what's more is that as the discipline, as the questions the discipline asks about this particular data, these, again, beginning with the old-timey stuff that people at a particular stratum of society did, we recognize that these same kind of activities were taking place outside of that strata, outside of the country people, and happening in cities. And it was not simply about the equivalent sort of working class, close to the earth, unlettered people, but the middle classes, the upper classes, we all participate in this kind of communication. Our texts might be different, but fundamentally we are doing the same kind of thing. So the discipline of folklore has shifted away from it being this study of this old-timey stuff, which is still present, but this old-timey stuff is now understood as a consequence of the same kind of dynamic, intelligent, interesting communicative processes that we also engage in, and that we're on this continuum. It's not that we are always doing folklore, but all of us at some time are engaging in that kind of things that a folklorist is interested in studying. Sometimes the classic definition by Dan Benamos is artistic communication in small groups, where we're not talking about the kind of stuff, we are not talking about the age of the stuff, we're not talking about the source of the stuff. We are basically saying that within these contexts of immediacy, we are engaged in some kind of communicative action. And what does he mean by group? Because group, again, you could think about the folklore of the Celts or the folklore of a particular place. And these large inheritances, these large groups that we might belong to that are cultural or national or ethnic and so on. And those are all, again, legitimate forms of inquiries of study. But we also have groups that are defined by our occupations. We have groups that are defined by our fan interests. We could be talking about groups that don't necessarily have a specific name to them, but nevertheless, our friendship circles, where our friendship circles have a large, thick set of likely overlapping references, in part because of the geographic context in which we live, and in part for in part, just what brings us together is likely a participation in other things, whether that is, we go to the same school or we live on the same block or whatever. But then the group has its own history, and its own history of mutual participation, where new stories emerge. Incidents happen and they become narratives, or they become the object of joke, or decisions are introduced into the group, like how to dress, how to be, music to listen to, and that has this ongoing resonance with the group. So to be a member of this, my friendship circle, is to have this shared sense of understanding. But I don't only belong to my friendship circle. I might have these same people might exist. I might commune with them in different ways, in the classroom, in my house of worship, in whatever sort of particular place. Moreover, I have groups that do not involve these people. I have my fan communities, the groups that exist online. I have my ethno-cultural heritage, and every now and then I gather together in those kind of forums, and I'm sort of celebrating, I don't know, Scottishness or Englishness or whatever. And it's not that these people, my friends, can't, it's just that they might not define themselves in that. And so if they do participate, they'd be sort of participating touristically, but with the amity and comity and friendship that might involve. So we belong to multiple groups at any given moment. And what's more, we know how to behave within those particular groups. The example I tend to give is decorum. I mean, when you are among your friends, you have an understanding of language and what is appropriate and what is inappropriate, in addition to a shared reference pool that you don't necessarily share when your family gets together. And so, the fact that you probably swear a lot among your friends and you probably don't swear a lot within your family doesn't mean that you are disingenuous. It doesn't mean that at one point you are authentic and one point you are inauthentic somehow. It just means that you understand the codes in the groups that you operate in and can operate therefore accordingly, or breach, knowing that a breach has happened here, where you swear in front of your friends there's nothing happening, you swear in front of your family and say, whoa, something big is happening. But everyone present has, even if they can't articulate it, they have an understanding of the group's ways of being in the world. And you haven't switched appropriately, or rather you are saying something by not following that particular code. And so we have this thing that's inherent in the study of folklore, which is this concept of tradition. And tradition is, sometimes people just define folklore as like traditional knowledge or traditional understanding or traditional practices, where tradition is sometimes, again, because it might exist, it might be associated with a group, we almost think that there is this level of authenticity, that this thing happened in the past, and this thing is carried forth through the participants almost by accident. And we elevate traditional as this sort of arbiter of the authentic, and then we sort of like, well, this isn't the traditional way of doing so, and we disparage that way of doing so, as opposed to thinking of tradition as already inherently a dynamic process, where it is a sense of the past, but more importantly, a sense of what is important and continues to have resonance that becomes executed, that becomes active each and every time a group does that thing and brings it forward. And by bringing it forward, there's a selective process. There is a reenactment process. It is, we have done it this way in the past, and whether, again, we might not be able to enumerate precisely that, but we have a sense of how we're enumerating it in the past, and I am doing it this way now. Sometimes it is incredibly important that I do it the way that went before. Sometimes this is just the loosest, thinnest of transcripts for the way I'm doing it this time. But it's that sense of continuity. So tradition is not, change is as important in the study of folklore as constancy. The tensions that we'll sometimes refer to are conservatism and dynamism, where conservatism is the impulse, the desire, the set of choices that are about keeping things constant, and dynamism is the set of choices that is about making things different or new, and that is where the creative tension lies. How do I sort of, on one hand, do this thing so it is recognizably part of a chain, and yet simultaneously it is immediately relevant? And there you go, this lovely tension. And all practices, even the most conservative practices, undergo dynamism, and even the most dynamic practices have an element of conservatism in them. And it's just sort of like there's a range, a continuum that exists between these two seemingly diametric poles. But that's where the real creativity of folklore exists. We have other terms that we'll use, something like verbal art, because it's handy to think of it that way. Where especially when we're talking about form, we're talking about formalized language. It is something that attracts attention to itself by virtue of it being recognizably shaped according to patterns that are beyond the merely instrumental. And so it is, certain kinds of speech acts. Now, sometimes people thought that folklore was limited to the verbal forms, and some definitions of folklore are verbal art. Okay, but it's good to sort of think of this this notion, and that there are even in its less articulated forms, like poetry, where or like certain forms of story, where we all recognize that there is something performative going on. Even in our casual conversations, it is shaped according to our sort of rigid ideas, and it's related to custom. It's not simply like here's this thing that we're this term I'm throwing out there just to sort of fill in the background. It's because when we study custom, well, when we study any aspect of folklore, but this course we're studying custom, so I'm going to use custom as the root. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Custom has verbal art associated with it, because there are often stories that get told. Sometimes there are very specific scripts, sometimes there are implicit scripts, but the people who are engaged in custom, these embodied practices that have to do with the reaffirmation of the group as it goes through some kind of change. There are often words that go with it. There are songs that go with it. There are expressions that go with it. There are forms of greetings that might go with it. So we want to sort of recognize that even if we forefront custom, the customary, we are simultaneously, we have language that's associated with it. Similarly, material culture. Material culture is the study of stuff, the things that are made, the creation of artifacts, whether those artifacts exist, have a particular time depth, like something made of stone, or something slightly more ephemeral, like cloth, where where the idea that it might not last forever, but it has a certain durability, it has a tangibility in time, to even things like food, where the food will it is created, it has tangibility, but at the same time it is there to eventually disappear. And its creation implies its eventual disappearance. So material culture is an entire field of folklore study in and of itself, but it's also so involved in custom, because custom often involves stuff, whether it involves the stuff of particular forms of vernacular architecture, like building a temporary shelter for the celebration of certain forms, or the clothes that you wear, where of all the possible outfits, you have this particular one. Or celebratory objects, or the giving of gifts, where the custom then becomes remembered in many ways, because the gift is a tangible thing that has durability, and so they enter into the realm of souvenir and memento about this particular shift. Not to mention the fact that material objects often have value, and we're not talking about the crass commercialism, but we're talking about the idea that they have they betray a certain amount of exchange of value in all senses of the word, not simply economic, but the fact that I am giving something to you because I value you, and we are into some form of exchange. So material culture is part of it as well. And then the custom, just to go back to our thing, custom is basically this doing stuff. If verbal art is saying stuff, if material culture is using or making stuff, then custom is doing stuff. It does involve movement. It involves the body. It is present. Now, of course, verbal art involves the body, and that it's not simply the telling, but it's also the gesticulation and so on, and it's associated often with particular times, or at least the way time is understood and people gathering together. Furthermore, material culture often involves, of course, the body, and both in terms of the manipulation of objects by the body, and the sort of the muscle memory of building and so on, and the gathering together, and the customary behavior of gathering together in order to create something. The quilting bee is as much about the conversation that happens at the quilting bee, the making of the quilt, and the sociability of gathering and collaborating while doing so. All three things are in play. So again, as I discussed in the last video, sometimes you could make references to sort of the customary behavior that is done in the solo sphere, but for this course, we are talking mostly almost exclusively about those customs that are collaborative, the customs that are about the gathering together. There's a couple of other things to think about when we talk about customs, particularly. Those are the forms of behaviors that are present, and that's the idea of ritual drama. And ritual drama has to do with this notion that there are some kind of scripts in place that we will often assume a kind of role, a role that is sometimes parallel to that of the officiant, to that of the celebrant, but over and above it. That by being a celebrant, we are also going to be imitating someone who similarly went through some kind of celebration that way. Sorry, there's a lot of crickets around here. I didn't realize the crickets would be picking up. I don't know if they're on the microphone, but hey, rustic sounds are always good. So, and then in other forms, less so with rites of passage, but often very much so with calendar customs or certain other forms of custom. There is a very specific script where we are basically reenacting what went before. And by reenacting, it's not a play in the same way that a piece of theater is a play. It is embodying an important narrative. And by embodying that narrative, with that narrative we understand within our group as having actually been, as existing in time and space, by reproducing it with our bodies, as well as through material culture, as well as through the retelling of the narrative as we do so. But by reenacting it, we are almost literally is not the right word, but the sense is that we are transcending the space and the time between where we are currently and the events at that particular moment. A good example of this are things like the Seder, the Passover supper that happens at Passover in Jewish households, where there's literally a script that is followed, and the questions that are asked as one eats the special foods. And why are we doing this? To remind us of this time back in Egypt when they had to eat this meal very quickly, or prior to the Exodus narrative. Or if we talk about the Hajj, I'm sorry I'm using religious examples, but religious examples are often very clear because they are this precise echo. We talk about the Hajj, the pilgrimage. That's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, where one goes to Mecca, one wears special clothing, and one reproduces the path of Muhammad as he goes to the Kaaba, and it is a ritual drama where you are not transcending space there because you go there. It's a form of pilgrimage, and pilgrimage is where you actually go to the events where things happen, but you are transcending time. You are reproducing it, but it is not mimicry. It is embodiment, and it is an embodiment that transcends time. And that's an idea that is fun to have in our heads, and it might be strange to have this in our heads at a time when we're not talking about in a class that we're not really defined by religion. This is not a religious studies course, but there are these implications that are throughout, because we'll often see that same kind of reenactment is kind of important. There's this wonderful study that maybe I'll link to somewhere in the page of a celebration that takes place at Atlantic Canadian University, and it had its origins in a time when a whole bunch of people wanted to go see a Stevie Ray Vaughan concert at the university. And then the concert got canceled. And they had all this money that they had saved up for this road trip to go see Stevie Ray Vaughan. And they decided that they were going to instead just lock themselves in their rooms and just get drunk all day. And then the next year, people did it again. And they did it again and they did it again. They've done it for decades now. Sometimes with the approval, often without the approval of the administration. So as they do so, they're reenacting that event, not simply the lockdown, but in terms of how they dress. And they'll retell the story, and they will reenact basically this one day of lockdown. It's not the most profound foundational narrative, but it's a very fascinating foundational narrative. And if you think about what you do at certain events, you'll often find that they are reenactments. Baptism is a reenactment of a sacred narrative. And again, I'm using religious examples, but we do it again. We do it again. And we do it again not simply to imitate, we do it again to relive, to re-embody. So, high school reunions, you go back to the place, you listen to the same music, you sort of have like a prom, or you have kind of like a more like a sock hop type thing. Yeah, you've got better catering. Yeah, you've got worse hairlines, but you're reenacting those glory days of 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Oh my Lord. And one of the last things to think about is magic, and how important magic is often in the realm of custom. And magic, one of the things that we go back to is James Frazer's idea of sympathetic magic, where like acts upon like, and that things are connected to each other. Things are connected to each other in one of two ways, either because they've been in direct contact with each other. So this thing, this artifact that someone in the past has touched, still has some part of that person within it, and it gives it some kind of special power. And you might think, so we do have that again in the religious aspect in terms of like relics and reliquaries and so on. But just think about what happens when we talk about something like an autograph. If you've ever had something signed by a celebrity, the thing is that they have touched that. And they have touched, the signature is kind of proof that they have been in contact with that. And all of a sudden, that picture becomes just that little bit more special. Or if it's like, when someone passes away and you take an object, you're given an object from them. Like this is grandma's spoon. It can be a very modest object, but it's like, she is somehow, this object is somehow imbued with grandma. It's a thing. And the other way is sympathetic magic, where an object that is similar to another object tends to have, or resembles another object, tends to have some kind of power associated with it. So that's one of the things that we think about in terms of icons. We think about drawings, or we think about statuary or so on, that there is a connection between the representation of a thing, even if it's never been in contact, but the representation of typically a person. It could be a piece of landscape, but typically a person, and the person themselves, and again, whether they are still around or whether they are in the past. And so there's a power. Here's a good example of where the two meet. If you think about the concept of the voodoo doll, and sort of kind of forget the very glib folk religion aspect of what you might imagine by the voodoo doll, but the idea that there is an object that both resembles a person and typically contains something of that person that has been in contact, something often very potent, like nail clippings or hair or something. That object has a connection, double connection to the person. Another form of sympathetic magic is things like the power of photographs and images. If you've ever broken up with someone and you're like, and you tear up their pictures, and it's like, by tearing up the picture, I am tearing you up, good sir. It's like, well, there you go. So magic is going to be incredibly important concept to think about, to entertain, because especially when we're thinking about the sort of performative aspect that we are doing when we are engaged in ritual drama, when we think about the material culture that we are participating in or that we have, and the fact that it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be enormous, it doesn't have to be these sort of like bizarre psychodramas that people do not necessarily participate in if they're not people of religious faith. But it could be things like, I'm using grandma's bowl to serve the mashed potatoes because it's grandma's bowl and because it's always been here. And that provides this constancy that is not simply, that it just brings just that little additional aspect of specialness that is beyond mere repetition and comfort. It is the fact that this is somehow imbued with power. Fun idea to think about. So, it's going to be present in rites of passage, where we engage in particular forms, and it's going to be present in calendar customs as well. So, next video is where I start with basically the explainer videos. As I've mentioned, the explainer videos sort of are also meant to sit independent of the course as well, so other people could potentially use them. So I'll be doing Van Genep's rites of passage, and I cannot impress upon you enough how important it is. It's a very simple article in many ways. It's a very simple structure, and it's one of those things that if you haven't noticed it before, you'll read it and go, oh. And then we're going to be constantly referring back to Van Genep's rites of passage throughout, because passages are present in both the personal, but they're also, that structure is very important in terms of custom, in terms of calendar custom. So, but the video will have a sort of slightly different tone, and all the ones that are about, let Ian talk you through, and then quotes, or a particular article, are going to have this sort of independence of them. Anyway. I'm blathering, I'm at like 27 minutes, and even when I cut out all my stumbles and hesitations, I'll be a little bit short. I'll still be long. So I'm going to let you go. My name is Ian. I will see you soon. Be well, my friends, and bye-bye. Sorry, I'm blanking. Oh, sorry. There we go.